If you've been telling yourself a story that you're not enough or whatever your story is about your journey to date, then it may be time to update that story so that you can redefine what an expert is, or even decide, you know what, I actually don't even need to be an expert in order to put myself out there. Let's give them something to talk about. Let's give them something to think about. How about love, 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 love? That's what I'm talking about today, everybody. I'm talking about giving folks your thought leadership. And this episode is all about our inner critic that tells us to keep our mouth shut because we're not an expert. But hold on, before I get deep into it, let me just pause and say thank you for being here today with the Unlock Lab. I'm your host, Tosca DiMatteo. And if this is your first time here, then welcome. I'm so glad that you are. I am the founder of Tosca Coaching and Consulting, and I do all things transformation. I do keynote talks, group facilitation, conversations, and one-on-one coaching, just to name a few. To learn more about how I can help you at the corner of personal growth and professional breakthroughs, visit my website at coachtosca.com. So let's jump in. I'm really friggin' excited to talk to you about this particular inner critic, which is also connected to the inner critic that I talked about just a few episodes ago, which is what happens when we're at the edge of the comfort zone that we have and our inner critic shows up there, as well as this idea of perfectionism. This one, I think this you are not an expert is really closely tied with perfectionistic tendencies. And I really want to talk about this with you guys because it can be something that holds us back from doing the thing that we're meant to do in the world. And it can also delay us from doing the thing that would bring us joy and doing the thing that would actually be of service to whomever, to humanity, to who you want to help in the world. So I'm excited to give this a little bit of breathing room and some depth so that you can see if you identify with this inner critic hanging around. We have been conditioned in our society here that to have ultimate credibility, we're supposed to receive degrees and certificates and basically external validation to either do the thing that we want to do or to feel worthy enough to claim that we can do the things that we desire. Now, I'm not saying that these pursuits aren't valid or important, but we do have to ask ourselves the real reasons why we're doing them. Are they for vanity? Will this actually be the thing that gets us in the door we're trying to open for ourselves? Or is it the artificial confidence boost or permission slip that we think we need to go after and do the thing that we want to do? Now, look, this is very different than the process of enjoying, learning, and valuing growth that might be a strong value that you have. If this is the case, actually, then the inner critic that comes around and tells you you are not an expert might be a really sneaky one for you. It might be coming in the back door because it's real easy to say to ourselves, well, I can always learn more about X topic or Y topic, or, well, let me just read a few more books. Oh, let me just get another certificate or two. And in the age where we get to post all these things on LinkedIn and get all the congratulations, it can be real addictive to keep going out and getting more information versus putting ourselves out in the world with what we have to say, with our opinions, with our experience, with our knowledge base. Now, you know that most of the time when I have something to say to you, I'm saying it from personal experience, and I will definitely share some of my personal stories as it relates to this particular inner critic. But I want you to think about either yourself or people that you know that put this roadblock in front of themselves that says, well, if I do this, then I can do that other thing. Well, if I do this, then I can start that project, or then I'll speak up. I mean, nothing gets my goat more than when I'm sitting in front of a super capable, intelligent person that has something to say and they are getting in their own way of putting it out there. This episode is for those people, but it can get really convoluted because, I think we also want to make sure that we're legit, right? And that we're not putting stuff out there that maybe somebody can poke holes in. I mean, again, that's what our inner critics are for, right? Our inner critics are to keep us safe, protect us from ridicule, embarrassment, all that stuff. And I think that that's what this particular inner critic does, which is protect us from, public embarrassment. And I think this particular inner critic is even more important to talk about in this age of just information overload. It is really easy to access tons and tons of information on topics. So I think it's easy for our inner critic to show up and say, well, there's more that you can learn. There's more that you can learn. Of course there is. Of course there's more that you can learn and do before you actually go and do the thing. But what's really powerful is the learning process that happens when you just put yourself out there. And oh, by the way, what I would love for you to do, if this is resonating for you, is define expert. That would be a really great exercise. And I've actually had some of my clients do this, which is like, well, define when you get to say you're an expert. It'll be really interesting for you to find out what you actually think and the difference between what you actually think and what your inner critic thinks that an expert is. Let me give you some examples of when this inner critic can show up. This inner critic that tells you you're not an expert might show up when you're in rooms with people that you deem as the experts or that you deem as smarter than you. This inner critic might show up when you're nearing the edge of your comfort zone, which is again why I think it's really closely linked to that particular inner critic that I talked about in one of my episodes. This can also show up when you are starting a side hustle or a business, when you're doing something new, or when you want to start charging for that thing that you used to do for free. This inner critic can also show up when you're considering a career shift or a transition into something that maybe you are less familiar with than what you've been doing for the past however many years or decades. And this inner critic can show up when you feel called to share your thoughts in any format, whether that's a book, a blog, a podcast, or even the meeting room. I've given you some examples of what this inner critic sounds like, but I want to give you some more ways that this inner critic may be talking to you. The inner critic may say, you don't have enough experience to talk about X, Y, or Z. You didn't go to school and study X, Y, or Z. You barely know what you're talking about. People will see right through you. Look at all those other people that actually studied or have that experience. What right do you have trying to talk about it? This inner critic might also say things like, you aren't saying anything new. So what's the point? What's the point of even putting it out there? It's not going to make a difference. And I mentioned before, right, that this inner critic can put obstacles in front of you. Well, if you do these things, and then maybe you do those things, and then the inner critic puts more things on top of the list. Oh, yeah, right. I should also do these other things. And so it's never enough. The inner critic keeps moving the goalpost for you. Your inner critic could also say something like, what you have to say could never fill a book. You don't have enough content. You don't have enough to say about this. It's shallow. And like I said, this inner critic can bring up certain feelings. And sometimes our inner critics show up as feelings and not necessarily messages in our head. So feelings of fear or embarrassment or ridicule, it may come up as a feeling. So consider that when you're about to open your mouth, or when it's even as simple as engaging in a debate within your family about a topic. And it doesn't have to be politics. Maybe it's, which pie should be served. But let's make it light, shall we? But I think that, look for all the examples in your life where you might be censoring yourself because you're telling yourself, well, you don't know enough. You're not an expert. It can show up in very particular situations. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. When we unlock even those very specific situations where our inner critic is driving our decisions and keeping us small and keeping us safe, even when we can unlock those, it has massive effect on our life. It has ripple effects. And so it is important to say, yeah, let me stop doing that thing that's actually not serving me or others that I actually want to serve. And as with all inner critic work, we have to ask ourselves, what is the truth here? Right? Because all those things I just rifled off, we have to ask, well, what is actually the truth? And let me share some of these universal truths that may help you to discover for yourself what your particular truth is. And the first is that your experience is valid. I don't know how many times we get invalidated saying that our experience isn't enough, whether that's explicitly stated or not. It's often how we interpret messages or actually the message we receive, which is that our experience isn't valid. The other truth is that when we are trying to be of service to whatever, to whomever, you only need to be one step ahead of the person you're trying to help. And in fact, if you are 100 steps ahead, it can be even harder to help that person because you're so far removed from where they are. Let that sink in. Sometimes when you have just been through the thing and gotten through it and are on the other side and have some wisdom to share and some tools to share, that's really, really helpful for somebody who's just that one step behind you. And that's the truth. Think about the times where you've looked for counsel and advice. Have you looked for counsel and advice from people that haven't experienced that in a long, long time, or somebody who's kind of freshly through it? Another truth is that it's not ever possible to know everything about any one topic. Again, this is where the perfectionist stuff comes in. So you get to determine when is enough enough. When are you ready to take the leap of faith? Because that's what it takes to put yourself out into the world with your thought leadership, with your opinions, with your perspective. It takes a leap of faith because we're usually not 100% ready when we start to open our mouths, but we're willing to take the risk. And it's okay to acknowledge where your knowing comes from. That may not be the freaking degree or their certificate or the fancy school name on your resume or what have you. I'll give you a real life example of this. I'm often asked, so how did I get into transformation work? How is it that I'm able to do this? It's basically a way that people ask me for my credibility. And I get it. There's not a whole ton of people that do this work. And how does one kind of prove that they can help people in transformation? And I'm not going to lie. When I used to get these questions, my inner critic used to come out loud and proud and start to wonder if what I really need to do is go back and get a degree in psychology or change management or other kinds of studies and modalities having to do with transformation. Heck, maybe become a shaman or, some other pathway like that. But those thoughts were actually really fleeting because I knew my truth was that this is something that is both learned through experience and also very innate in who I am and how I serve. And the truth is that I have walked deeper in the path of transformation than any degree or certification could ever give. I've walked the corporate path. I've walked the self-healing path. These are my credentials. I've walked the path of walking my talk, and it's not theoretical, something that I learned from a book. I learned from doing it, making mistakes, coming back around to the same thing that I'm trying to break through the other side on. And I've gathered a lot of tools in the process, made a lot of sacrifices. I've won some and I've lost some. This is my truth of why I'm an expert. And I think that going through the exercise for yourself and saying, why am I totally valid in being able to talk about this thing that I want to talk about? And what makes me think of, like, even in this moment, right? It's like, I may not be a parent, but I was a child once and I have nieces and nephews. Is it okay for me to talk about things around children and guiding children? Sure. I have different perspectives on it than perhaps being an actual mother who birthed a child. But it doesn't mean that my thoughts aren't valid. It means it comes from a different point of view. I'll give you another example of real life when I've had to face this inner critic of, are you an expert? And this one is very present and relevant. So you may know, or maybe you don't, that in October, the end of October, I'm giving a keynote talk on influencing change. And the title of this talk is Unapologetic Advocacy for a New Tomorrow. When I had the opportunity to submit a proposal for this conference, which was all about influencing change, I was freaking ecstatic. My whole life has been about helping people to do something differently, to get a different result for how they want this one life to be lived. I deeply excavated what I thought about this topic, my perspective on the topic in order to submit the proposal. And months later, I was given the opportunity and I was so ecstatic. But immediately following that excitement, my inner critic came out and was questioning if I even knew what the bleep I was talking about. And my inner critic made me start thinking immediately about folks that are super known for making huge changes in the world. Like my inner critic was comparing myself to MLK and Nelson Mandela and Gandhi. Like, oh my God, like, what do I know about driving change? Look at these people, Wow, I really had to slow my roll. I was pitting myself up against these incredible leaders with droves of support, with massive social change agendas. I was setting impossible bars for myself. And I had to do exactly what I'm preaching to you today. I had to look at the truth of how I have driven change within myself and others. Whether that was convincing shared resources within corporate to give my project more time and attention, whether it was breaking my own patterns of self sabotage, or supporting my clients to make new decisions that would lead them to their desired future. I had to take a close look at the tools in my toolbox and to also look at the results and to say, this is valid. And that the truth is that my tools come from many disciplines and a variety of experiences, and it comes from my wins and also my failures. And actually, what makes me powerful is knowing that there were things that worked and didn't work. And I've seen these things over and over again to create a depth of understanding of what it takes to influence change, to first be the change, and then to be able to engage with others to influence change around me. I share this with you because I get it. Maybe we put ourselves out for the scary thing, thinking, well, I'm not sure if I'm even going to get it. Then we get it and we're like, oh my God, what did I just do? Maybe it's you got the job and then you're like, holy crap, am I prepared? Can I do this? And that's your inner critic. And the inner critic is usually going right to the worst case scenario. That's how we're wired. We're wired to be like, oh my gosh, what if this doesn't work out? And what is the worst that could happen? If you went after that job that felt like a stretch, if you started writing a book about the thing you're so passionate about, if you engage in a conversation about your thoughts on a vast and complicated topic, like what's the worst that could happen? But more importantly, what's the best that could happen? Sometimes when we think about the worst that could happen, we see it's not as bad as we've made up in our head when we actually follow that question and look at the truth. The worst that could happen is, the job doesn't work out. And so I find another one, right? We're used to kind of thinking about it in our head, but not really doing the excavation of like, what would I actually do if this thing didn't work out? But we can flip the script on that and orientate ourselves towards, well, what's the best that could happen? Maybe I meet incredible people. Maybe I refine my ideas. Maybe I get to plant seeds with people that really makes a difference because of the way I said it, because of my perspective on the world. And here's another truth. Maybe it's actually not the quote unquote experts that are best poised to have the thought leadership. Maybe it's actually those who are just on the fringes who get to push the envelope in new directions. Because your particular experience, the particular dots that you're going to connect, because your experience may not look like other experts in the field, might just be the differentiator that creates a flywheel for yourself because you have something new and different and valuable to say that only you can say and that will only land because you're the one saying it. The next thing I want you to consider is what's the risk of holding yourself back? What's the risk of not doing a thing. Some of these things include not giving yourself a chance to learn forward. You're not giving yourself a chance to refine your thoughts. And perhaps you're preventing someone from learning from what you have to say, from your experience. Maybe you're selling yourself short. And actually, the reason why you're here at this moment, at this time, to share your thoughts is because there are certain people that need to hear it from you. So, I want to leave you with some questions to ask yourself as it relates to this inner critic that tells you, back up, you're not an expert. Ask yourself if fear is in the driver's seat right now. You can also ask yourself, what would you say to your child, your niece, or your best friend if they were in this situation? How would you counsel them? And what would be the next smallest action you could take to honor your desire? Let me tell you, you've lived a life. You've been through some things. You are completely valid in sharing what you've learned from those things. You don't need a degree, you don't need a certificate. And it doesn't mean that you have to be 100% right all the time. Watch out for that perfectionist. What it means is you have a point of view, you have something to share. You have something that you think is valuable to other people. You may not know exactly who quite yet, but you know it in your bones. And if you know it in your bones, then I'm inviting you to take a leap of faith, to be willing to go to the edge of your comfort zone and take the next step, because who knows what's possible on the other side. And my guess is it's not going to be the worst case scenario that you've made up. So I finished recording this episode on the inner critic that comes up and likes to say you are not an expert. And there was something that felt like I was missing a piece, or I was missing one of the points that I wanted to make. What I discovered was that really, if we zoom out a little bit on this inner critic, it's really the inner critic that tells us we're not ready yet. And it often manifests in terms of because we don't have enough knowledge, we're not the expert, we don't know enough yet. So I just wanted to also bring this in. This idea of the inner critic that says you're not ready yet is closely linked with the one that I talk about in terms of being at the edge of your comfort zone, starting to do the scary thing, and the inner critic comes up and says, no, don't do that. But there is some nuance here. So I just want to kind of take a shot at articulating the inner critic that wants to say we're not ready. This can vary from you're not ready to take that vacation to that international location that you've been wanting to go on for a long time. You're not ready. You don't have enough money saved, right? Or you're not ready to charge for, being a photographer and taking either studio pics or maybe event pics, or maybe you want to be a wedding photographer and you've purchased the camera and you've played around and you've done all the things, and your inner critic is saying you're not ready. And that's slightly different than saying you're not an expert, right? Because you may be sitting there and saying, you know what, like I don't actually need to be an expert and I'm actually comfortable with how much I know, but there's still something holding you back. And maybe what's holding you back is that energy of you're not ready. And I think I kind of talked about this with the inner critic that comes up when you're at the edge of your comfort zone as it relates to the TED Talk, because one of the types of messages that came up, right, was like, well, you're not ready. Like you haven't done enough things. You haven't had enough exposure. You haven't honed your craft enough. And in a way, that is this idea of questioning, like, am I ready for such a big opportunity? Am I ready to sit on Oprah's couch and have a conversation about what I'm passionate about? Am I ready to go all in on my business and take that leap of faith? So, I was battling between, do I just call this inner critic the one that comes up when you think you're not ready? But I didn't name it that because I think it's a little bit too close to the one that I talk about when you're at the edge of your comfort zone. But the reason why this language matters and the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because of the truth of inner critic work, which is that if you're not paying attention, then you really don't know how much the inner critic is playing a role in your life. I literally just started working with a client, and she's a little bit on the younger side. She was really hard on herself, but she couldn't see how much her inner critic dialogue is a part of her daily life, hourly life, because she puts a positive spin on things and she puts on a positive mindset. But that is different than really being aware of what you're saying to yourself and how harsh you are to yourself. So sometimes if I articulate it in one way, it might resonate with somebody. And if I articulate it in another way, it might resonate with somebody else who says, oh, yeah, that's the thing that I do. Yeah, really what it comes down to is I don't think I'm ready. Or really what it comes down to is like I'm really at the edge of like what I'm comfortable with. Or really what it comes down to is I don't think I'm an expert and have a right to speak up. A lot of these are really linked, but the different language may plant a different type of seed for you. So that's why I just wanted to have this little tag on here in case it's helpful. So thank you for paying attention to what you're saying to yourself. And if you're not sure if you have an inner critic problem in your life, then my invitation would be to journal for 2 weeks straight and write down all the things that you say to yourself. Now, writing them on a piece of paper, I think is fabulous, or a journal, but you can also do it in your phone and know that whatever it is you're questioning, if you're ready for, I'm going to guarantee you're ready. So just do the damn thing, will ya? And let me know how it goes. Well, I know I could keep going on and on about this topic because we are so conditioned that nothing is ever enough. Our knowing is not enough. Our path was not enough. Our experience was not enough. And the way that we can unlearn this is by looking at the truth and the validity of our own experience. I mean, I'm sitting here with you today with a background in marketing who shifted her career to be all about transformation. And I have a whole story about why this is the work that I was meant to do. And that's part of my branding story. And if you missed it, go back and listen to Managing Your Personal Brand. It was a 3-part series because part of this is maybe rewriting your narrative. If you've been telling yourself a story that you're not enough or whatever your story is about your journey to date, then it may be time to update that story so that you can redefine what an expert is, or even decide, you know what, I actually don't even need to be an expert in order to put myself out there. Those are just some added thoughts for you. But I'm so excited that you stayed and listened here because I think it could be life-changing. The world needs your voice. The world needs your story. The world needs your wisdom. And I would love to hear what you have to say. Reach out if you want to let me know what it is you're deciding to do differently because of this podcast. And if this podcast touched you in a certain kind of way, please follow, like, rate, review on whatever platform you're listening on, because that's just a beautiful way for this exchange to work. I give you some counsel, you give me a little love in return. I'm all about it. All right. Well, thank you again for being here in the Unlock Lab. I look forward to seeing you next time, and ciao for now.